Greetings. I'm Professor Sheth at Emory University. This presentation is about why cultures vary or different from each other, as we know. Surprisingly, in anthropology, while we have the classification or typology, characteristics, attributes, but we don't have a good theory about why cultures vary or why cultures differ from each other. This particular area became of interest to me in the 70s when I did a major study for Coca-Cola International about the consumption of Coca-Cola in different parts of the world. So the major findings we found that in some countries they only drank 64 bottles per capita per year, and other countries 400 bottles per capita per year. And the question is, why such a large range? Is there an explanation? Of course, all managers have explanations. They have theories of their own. Somebody thought it's bad water, for example. Somebody thought that it may be socioeconomic problems. Lower income countries cannot consume Coca-Cola. It's an expensive drink. And you have the substitutes also, free water, for example, or hot tea, or wine, for example. There are alternatives, in other words. And why does Coca-Cola differences between countries, not how much it is drunk within a country and which are the segments, but this is between countries. So that became a very interesting project for me. And I'll give the answer later on as we talk more about this specific area of why cultures differ from each other. Similarly, when you go to North India as opposed to South India, which is a country with a lot of up and down axis, you may find that there is a homemade cheese called paneer, very popular, very common in North India. However, in South India, there is no concept of cheese at all, which led to research. I found that, for example, if you go to Northern Europe, like Scandinavian countries, the fat content in the cheese is about 40%. As you come to the Mediterranean countries, Greece, Italy, etc., you find that the cheese content has only 2.5% fat content, a Parmesan, a mozzarella, etc. And as you come closer to equator, the concept of cheese drops. Body needs saturated fat, but it switches from the animal-based saturated fat to vegetation-based or plant-based saturation fat. In Mexico, it is avocado, which is eaten daily by people. It is surprisingly olive oil in many parts of the Mediterranean countries. It is palm oil in many parts of Southeast Asia, like Indonesia, Malaysia. And of course, it is coconut oil, which is very prevalent in South Asia and parts of Africa. It's very interesting to watch that cheese is not the dominant part or animal-based diet as common among North countries as opposed to global South, as we call it now themselves. In other words, less economically, around the equator primarily, more tropical countries usually have a less consumption of meat in general, less consumption of dairy products, etc. I also found fascinating by raising a question why some cultures are punctual and others are not. I experienced myself. I come from a warm country and time is not as critical. You can have we call it chalta hai, it's okay. Or mañana, as it is called in Mexico, for example. Or Jamaican have their own sayings about, be happy kind of stuff. Don't worry about the time. Whereas in some other countries, time is very essential. And generally, Northern Europeans are more time sensitive than Southern Europeans. In other words, compare Swedish or a Scandinavian country versus Italy, for example, or Italy and Greece for that matter. So why countries are different or cultures are different in punctuality? I also found something very fascinating, why some cultures plan for the future. They have to have everything planned out and make sure it's operationally done well. In the corporate world, we still do the budgeting, for example, a year out in a 3 to 5 year plan. Whereas in some other cultures, there is no concept of reducing uncertainty. We plan to reduce uncertainty to get familiar about the future so we can manage it or we can intervene. Whereas other cultures really live in the present. They think it's all about the destiny and there is nothing you can do about it. All of this led me to do research in why cultures differ from each other. And as I told you, I did not find any satisfactory answer in the traditional anthropological literature. My own view is very different. Unfortunately, because of the British Empire and colonial expansion, we always thought about differences east-west. In fact, there's a famous saying by Rudyard Kipling that the east is east, the west is west, and the twain shall never meet. By the way, he's dead wrong. He's not only dead, but he's wrong also. Have you seen the westernization of the Asian children in China, in Korea, in India, any one of those countries? And now we see the easternization of the world taking place in terms of meditation, yoga, spirituality, cuisines, color, whatever it turns out to be. So that does not seem to be the explanation anymore. It might be a perspective from the Western world viewpoint. So in search of all this, I found that the real difference arises primarily by the genes adapting as they migrated from Africa, especially to the north toward the Arctic climate. In other words, in the extreme cold, for the genes to survive, they have to rely more on animal because there is no vegetation. So diet basically consisting of protein, fat, and calories all comes from the animal, whether it's a sheep or whether it's a cow or whatever the animal is possible. As you go further toward the south, diets change toward a plant-based. Northern European diet is primarily meat and potatoes. That's all they can grow, potatoes, and store it over time. But as you go to our southern Mediterranean countries, you will see a huge variety of nuts, for example, like cashew nuts or almonds or whatever the nuts are there, and of course salads quite a lot. This difference is pretty much there, so I will focus on the Northern Europe versus Southern Europe because the differences are so sharp and generalized to other parts of the world. So let's go through the presentation as I gave the introduction around here, why people vary in their food consumption. And by the way, food is less spicy in the north because they can't grow any spices. Food is very spicy in the south, mainly because they can grow all the varieties of spices. India is very famous. In fact, people came from the Dutch land through the South Africa to get the spices from India. And there are tropical countries that have spices as natural antioxidants and antibacterial devices. It's like a medicinal use, daily consumption primarily. And as I talked about the cheese example where Northern European cheese comes from animal fat, Southern Europeans don't have a concept of the cheese, especially toward the equator, for example, it is olive oil or coconut oil or some other oil. So if you take the slide I have on the food and beverage differences, you can easily see there is a two-dimensional difference. Countries are either animal-based for calorie, protein, and fat, or they are more and more vegetation-based for the same calorie, protein, and fat. And the second dimension is countries that are non-spicy in the diet versus countries that are spicy. On the upper right, you will see tropical climate. In tropical climate, it is more plant-based diet and it's quite spicy. Surprisingly, it is spicy in the desert climates. So deserts of Sahara, for example, or Gulf countries, or wherever there is a desert, where the food is spicy, but it is not vegetation-based, it's animal-based. Arctic is the opposite of tropical, where everything is animal-based, and of course it's non-spicy. And temperate, which is in between Arctic and tropical, is vegetation-based, relatively speaking, not 100%, but it is non-spicy. So we can explain the differences in foods across countries based upon the climate of north-south axis. What about clothing? Food, shelter, and clothing are three basic necessities. So I did the analysis of shoes. If you go to the extreme Arctic climate, Scandinavia again as a representation, or Russia for that matter, people have to wear boots, not just shoes, and sometimes two pairs of socks to protect themselves against extreme cold. As you come further down, from north to south, the boots become shoes, shoes become sandals, like southern Italy, for example, and sandals becomes tongs. Interesting correlation. So you have less covering on your feet as you go toward the tropical, toward the equator in general, and the reverse flow happens the same way on the other side. Also true of clothing. Northern Europeans, the source for raw material would be only animal, therefore leather and wool are the preferred materials. They make their garments out of those and wear them. There are no color choices because there is no vegetation to provide you dyes. So more pastel colors is what they wear. They don't have fancy color spectrum. But as you go toward the warmer climate, first of all, the raw material switches from leather and wool to cotton, sometimes linen. Interesting. And the color preferences. Have you seen the colorful saris in India that women wear, or the native African dress, or Mexican native dress culture? No matter where you go, you will see around the equator, all cultures are very colorful in their dresses. In the northern European area, you have to have a 3-layer garment you wear. An inner layer, a mid layer, and an outer layer, and on top of that you might have even a jacket. That is to protect against cold. This multiple layer, tight fitting by the way also, so contours of the body shows. As you go to warmer climate, there's only one layer, no undershirt, for example, for men. And this is very interesting to watch, that as they go toward the warmer climate, the garment has to be free-flowing, so you can have a hydration, dehydration throughout your body, not just from the exposed area of a highly covered material primarily. That's another very interesting area. So, food, shelter, clothing. Let's come to shelter. Northern Europeans have only resources which are rocks, mountains, and maybe some, I guess, on mountains, whatever forest you can grow, fir or whatever turns out to be. As you go further south, it's more and more clay, riverbeds, material out of that one, bricks, etc. You can clearly see the difference when it comes to shelter. Shelter will be going from stones primarily in cold climate to clay, and of course in the northern European climate, indoor outdoor are insulated from each other. In fact, we have the concept of sort of the entry point, we call it a veranda or a foyer, because from extreme cold to come inside the house, which is warm, you need a buffer zone. Every architect knows this thing. But in management and in marketing and in consumption area, we do not talk about this difference. In Northern Europe, all roofs will be A-shaped, so that the snow cannot stay there, otherwise it will collapse the roof. You have to have the snow fall down constantly as it snows. Warmer climates, it's all flat. Indoor-outdoor is totally integrated rather than isolated. So you have the balcony and you have a door, and in between you can go, it's the same thing. You can expand your living room into the balcony, for example, whereas in Northern Europe that's not possible. It's generally insulating each other, which is again very interesting. So indoor-outdoor separation is very key in some parts of the world, and of course integration of indoor-outdoor is very key in some other parts. Italian villas, for example, Greek villas, you can clearly see that those are outdoor-indoor combined things, as will be south in the United States, same thing. This is very important to understand. So while we understand climatic explanations for food, shelter, and clothing, Let's talk about climatic explanation for cultural attributes. And I've identified 8 attributes, and I'll take some time to talk about each one of them. There are cultural differences on time, as I mentioned. So time, punctuality is key ingredient. My view is that in Northern Europe you have such a short window of time in which to plant and harvest. If you miss the window for whatever reason, then obviously you go starving for the whole year. So it is out of a sheer necessity that you have to be punctual on time. When Mother Nature comes in, you have to be ready for that. Time is also considered among the Western European northern countries as asset, as a valuable asset. So time is a resource, just like money is a resource. And of course, time poverty creates stress quite a lot. So stress would be more common as a consequence of countries that are much more time driven. Second area is space. Time and location, space. Northern Europeans generally would tend to be more territorial, possessive. This is my property, this is my chair, this is my room, whatever turns out to be, as opposed to the sharing attitude, which would be very, very common among the warmer climate people, sort of the community behavior as opposed to individual behavior. There is a very nice saying in the Western world, came from England, I think, good fences make good neighbors. We believe in very strongly our territorial aspects pretty much. And Northern Europeans have a strong preference for privacy. Don't share my personal information with anybody, whereas among the southern countries, generally sharing information is okay, does not matter because I'm a part of a community and the community knows who I am. Third cultural attribute that anthropologists and marketers have begun to look at is the uncertainty avoidance. So why Northern Europeans tend to be more avoidance of uncertainty by planning. So tolerance for ambiguity is not there, again out of sheer necessity. If you miss a window of time, you miss your livelihood. So you have to be on time and you have to avoid uncertainty by planning out how the world will look like. It is also a part of risk-taking versus risk-sharing. Risk-taking would be more common among the Northern Europeans, and risk-sharing will be more common among the Southern Europeans. And the only way I can explain the difference in terms of planning is to compare an Indian wedding or with a Christian wedding, a Hindu wedding versus a Christian wedding. First of all, Indian weddings are much larger in size. Those are like a Greek fat movie, a movie for Greek fat wedding. The Indian weddings are very large, very colorful, but also at the same time, there is no planning. There is an event planning. Nobody shows up on time. You don't have to be on time, which is very interesting culture. People come when they feel like coming. I remember attending my grandniece's wedding 10 years ago in India, and in the middle of the wedding, the priest got a cell phone call, and he took it. 20 seconds he's going on negotiating his next appointment or whatever it was. Everybody is fine. There was no problem, which is very interesting. I was the only one getting agitated. This is not appropriate because I'm so much westernized in my own daily behavior. On the other hand, if you take a Christian wedding, typically everything is planned out year and a half. There is a run-off show, every detail is done, and there should be no surprise whatsoever. In fact, any surprise is a negative connotation. Nobody should object to the wedding. Priest knows what to do, bride knows what to do, bridegroom knows what to do, all of the ushers, etc., they know what to do. It's all rehearsed, and then the event takes place. Everybody is tense. Indian weddings, everybody is just laughing, etc. Here is tenseness pretty much. And then when the wedding is over, there's a sigh of relief. It worked out exactly as per the run-off show that we had pretty much. Very different behavior. Why the difference? Again, if you look at the north versus south axis, you can explain the differences. Because time is the same from morning to evening in tropical country, Sun rises about the same time, sunset is about the same time. You don't have as much uncertainty about the future. In fact, I found fascinating till I come to America in 1961, about 62 years ago. I never watched weather in India. It's the same. 8-9 months, sun rises at about 6 o'clock, sun sets at 6 o'clock. Then you have the monsoon season, which is predictable again. Early June it will begin till end of August or something, which is again very predictable. So you do not need to watch the weatherman as we do in America. I got very curious about technology preference. Point number 4. Generally, Northern Europeans are pro-technology. Remember, Industrial Revolution started in the north, not in the south, even though south had the science. Greek philosophers, Greek mathematicians, Italian philosophers, Italian mathematicians. Science was pretty much the creation of the south. It's the Northern Europeans who automated and created the Industrial Revolution. So that's very interesting. And value of invention and patent is very important in the northern culture. You get all the intellectual property rights. Today, of course, it's becoming universal worldwide, but generally in many of the emerging economies, you don't think about patent protection, you don't think about exclusivity, you don't think about getting a monopoly power, etc. You simply share. So intellectual property rights are going to be very differently interpreted between countries. Point number 5. Next slide. Fear of friendship. In some cultures, friendship matters a lot, and in fact, you hire only people that you are friends with, or you know the friends. You don't hire strangers. So friendship actually is, in many countries, warm countries, is a trust surrogate. Whereas we rely on the rule of law, a contractual law, as a way of saying that's the only thing that matters between two parties. Nepotism and conflict of interest views are very different. In colder countries, generally nepotism is not allowed at all or encouraged. In warm countries, the person you invite to be, is basically somebody you know very well, which I think is a very different one. In fact, the way you will hire would be your own children first before anybody else kind of notion. So that's another big area that I found very different across cultures, which can be explained by the north-south axis. Similarly about agreement, point number 6. We believe in the rule of law. Nothing is appropriate. I can change my mind till I've signed the document. And once I've signed the legal document, I'm held accountable for whatever promises I have made. In many other parts of the world, especially below the equator countries or near the equator countries, they don't believe in that. They may go along signing because that's what the lawyer or attorney tells you now, but they don't believe. They violate the agreement because that's not the form. It's really verbal commitment that you make that makes a difference as opposed to a legal signature. Whole diamond industry, basically monopolized by India and Indian manufacturers and merchants. You'll find that they exchange hundreds of thousands of dollars of diamond from one merchant to the other with no signature, nothing. There's a trust factor. And the default rate is very low. There is none practically, because the punishment is very high, which is a social punishment to kick you out of the community, and therefore you cannot survive economically to do anything else. That's a very key area to understand. So pre and post agreement focus is the same way. We believe in pre-agreement focus, like in real estate I have to have a closing agreement or a closing document before actually people sign it, change the title, etc. So agreement is another area where there's a strong differences between cultures, and the only way I can explain is the north-south axis. Point number 7, collaboration versus competition. Same problem. Northern Europeans believe in competition. Southern nations generally believe in collaboration or partnership. They don't see any conflict of interest when two parties get together. Northern Europeans really would like to have more presence of competition than anything else. So trust but verified, as President Ronald Reagan mentioned about communism. I trust them, but I need to validate at the same time, which is the view of competition in the minds of the northern climate country people. By the way, I've been using Northern Europe primarily, but it can go across to Northern Japan, it can go across to Northern China, Northern Germany, whatever turns out to be the country is the same pattern around the world. And by the way, we give exclusivity rights through patents, through copyrights, etc., to an individual, and the penalties are very high for damaging that. In many parts of the world, they don't think about patent rights as the way to organize or give exclusive rights to some people and not others, like franchise by location or having a patent from the US Patent Office. Last point is individual over institution. This is the biggest debate. It's nothing to do with democracy. We link it with democracy. It has to do primarily with the culture. There are certain cultures where individual is more important than the institution. You will be sacrificing the institution in order to uphold or enable the human to unlock the potential. So role of self-interest is very key in performance outcomes. In the case of capitalistic competitive society, we believe that if I benefit the most, it's good for me, as opposed to sharing in the benefit. We have already seen respect for institution decline significantly with a religious institution, government institution, NGOs, employers, family situation, a family institution as a safety net, same problem. It is more and more relegated in the back as you go toward the north as opposed to the south. So let me conclude. There are strong differences among cultures in their food, shelter and clothing, habits and preferences. There are also strong cultural differences with respect to punctuality, uncertainty avoidance, friendship and territorial impulse. There is no good theory of why cultures vary with respect to cultural traits. North-south climatic zones ranging from the Arctic to tropical provide an explanation about why consumers differ in their habits as well as preferences in food, shelter and clothing. Genetic adaptations to climate zones are key to understanding strong biological differences in consumption of food, beverage and clothing. So I hope you have enjoyed this presentation. It is my favorite among hundreds I have done. It explains quite a lot about consumption differences. There is no such thing as a superior culture versus an inferior culture. Just because advanced countries are more economically advanced does not mean they are superior cultures. There are Eastern cultures or historical cultures which are very deep, very wise in their knowledge. So here it is basically suggesting an explanation rather than creating a hierarchy. If you wanted to know the difference as to why Italians behave differently than Germans, for example, or Scandinavians, here is a theory that explains that. As I have seen within the country, not just between countries. Thank you very much.